The morning of February 18th, 1820, arrived with a chill in the air and the sky heavy with gray clouds over Charleston, South Carolina. Nearly 2,000 people crowded outside the city's old jail, their breath visible in the cold as they waited for an event unlike any other in American history. They had come to see the execution of a woman who would later be remembered as the country's first female serial killer. Lavinia Fisher stood tall on the gallows, her posture unyielding even in her final moments. Some said she wore a white dress that day, possibly her wedding gown, though whether that's true or just another detail lost to legend is anyone's guess. As the crowd hushed, she was asked if she had any last words. What she said next would echo through the years, securing her place in the annals of American crime. "If you have a message you want to send to hell," she reportedly announced, "give it to me, for I'll be going there directly." Yet, the woman standing before that crowd was not the villain that stories would later make her out to be. The truth about Lavinia Fisher is far more complicated, tragic, and ultimately more intriguing than the myths that have grown around her name. Her story forces us to question what we think we know about America's early criminal history and makes us confront uncomfortable truths about justice, reality, and how legends can overpower facts. Before we get into this remarkable story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's most captivating crime stories. Lavinia Fisher's tale doesn't begin with murder, but with mystery. Born around 1793, probably in Charleston, Lavinia came into the world at a time when the United States was still shaping its identity. Charleston, during her childhood, was a lively port city where fortunes could be made or lost overnight. The wealthy lived in grand homes, while the poor struggled to get by, and the line between honest work and criminal activity was often blurred. There's little information about Lavinia's early years. Records from the late 1700s, especially about women from humble backgrounds, are scarce and often unreliable. What we do know suggests she grew up in a world very different from ours, a place where life was tough, justice was swift, and survival depended on adapting to whatever came your way. Charleston in the early 19th century was a city of stark contrasts. Rich plantation owners, whose wealth came from rice and cotton, lived in beautiful mansions along the waterfront. Their prosperity was built on the labor of enslaved people, who made up nearly half the city's population. But beyond the elegant homes and well-kept gardens, there was a rougher side to the city. Sailors, merchants, craftsmen, and a growing number of free people of color all tried to find their place in the complicated social structure of the antebellum South. For a young woman like Lavinia, choices were few. Marriage was often the only way to secure a future, and picking the wrong husband could mean the difference between comfort and hardship. Sadly for Lavinia, her choice in a partner would eventually lead her to the gallows. John Fisher was exactly the kind of man respectable families warned their daughters about. He was a drifter and a petty criminal, with a dangerous charm that made people trust him even when they shouldn't. When Lavinia married him, she entered a partnership that would shape the rest of her short life. Their criminal activities started small. The couple set themselves up as the owners of the 6-mile Wayfarer house, and in about 6 miles outside Charleston. Back then, inns like this were essential stops for travelers moving between towns. The roads were risky, and finding a safe place to spend the night was important. The 6-mile house, as it became known, was perfectly located on the main road into Charleston. Travelers arriving after dark would often stop there, planning to finish their journey in the morning. For the Fishers, these tired travelers were an opportunity. The inn itself was a simple 2-story building, nothing special to look at, but ideal for their needs. Later stories claimed it had a common room for meals and socializing, private rooms upstairs, and if you believe the legend's secret chambers where terrible things happened. But it's important to realize that the 6-mile house wasn't just a business for the Fishers. It was the center of a criminal operation that would frighten Charleston for years. The inn gave them the perfect cover, letting them spot wealthy guests, plan robberies, and hide evidence, all while pretending to be respectable hosts. Over the past 200 years, the legend of Lavinia Fisher has grown, often straying far from the truth. The most popular version of her story paints her as a cunning manipulator who greeted guests with southern hospitality, offering them a special tea made from poisonous oleander leaves. This deadly drink would knock out her victims, allowing John to rob and kill them as they slept. The story goes on to say that John would then drop the bodies through a trapdoor into secret rooms below the inn, where he'd dismember and bury them. When the authorities finally raided the 6-mile house, They supposedly found dozens of skeletons hidden beneath the floors, proof of years of murder. This version has been told again and again in books, articles, and on ghost tours in Charleston. It's got everything: a beautiful but deadly woman, a clever murder method, and a house of horrors worthy of Edgar Allan Poe. But the real evidence tells a different story. Modern historians who have looked at the original records found no proof that the Fishers ever killed anyone. No skeletons were found under the inn, no trapdoors were discovered, and no one ever testified about poisoned tea or secret rooms. What actually happened was less dramatic, but still criminal. The Fishers were part of a gang of highway robbers who preyed on travelers near Charleston. They used the inn as their base, gathering information about wealthy guests and their plans, then ambushing them on the road. It was a dangerous and illegal business, but it was robbery, not murder. The Fisher gang operated with a level of organization that was rare for the time. They built a network of informants and accomplices who would tip them off about potential targets. When a wealthy merchant or planter stayed at the 6 Mile House, the Fishers would learn about their business, their travel routes, and, most importantly, how much money or valuables they carried. The gang's tactics were harsh but effective. They usually struck on lonely stretches of road, using overwhelming force to quickly overpower their victims. The precision of their attacks suggested that some members might have had military experience, possibly from the War of 1812. Lavinia's involvement in these crimes was likely much greater than that of a typical criminal's wife. Reports from the time describe her as smart, charming, and ruthless. She was often the one who gathered information from unsuspecting guests, using her warmth and hospitality to make them feel at ease. She would learn their names, destinations, and business affairs, all while serving them dinner and making pleasant conversation. But Lavinia wasn't just the friendly face of the operation, she was also directly involved in the violence. Court records show she was present during at least one robbery, and witnesses described her as an active participant in the attacks. This was not a woman simply dragged into crime by her husband. She was a full partner in the gang's activities. The gang's reign of terror created a sense of fear throughout Charleston. Travelers began to avoid the roads at night, and those who had to travel took extra precautions. Local authorities were under mounting pressure to put an end to the robberies, but the gang was careful not to leave behind witnesses who could identify them. The beginning of the end for the Fishers came in early 1819 when they targeted a traveler named David Ross. Ross was a young man from Tennessee, traveling to Charleston on business. Like many others, he'd heard rumors about highway robberies in the area, but he had little choice but to continue his journey. Ross arrived at the 6 Mile House on the evening of February 17, 1819, exactly 1 year before the Fishers would face execution. Lavinia greeted him warmly, offering food and a place to stay for the night. Ross later said he found her charming, but there was something about her that made him uneasy. What happened next would become the key evidence against the Fishers. According to Ross's later testimony, Lavinia offered him a special tea, claiming it would help him sleep. Already suspicious, Ross pretended to drink it but secretly poured it out. He went to his room but stayed awake, alert for any danger. In the early morning hours, Ross heard footsteps in the hallway outside his door. He hid behind the door and waited. When the door opened, he saw someone enter with what looked like a weapon. Ross managed to escape through the window and ran into the night, but his ordeal wasn't over. The next morning, as he made his way toward Charleston, he was ambushed by 2 men who dragged him before a group that included Lavinia. Hoping for mercy, Ross looked to her, but instead, she attacked him, choking him and smashing his head through a window before he managed to break free. Ross immediately reported the attack to Charleston authorities, giving them detailed descriptions of his attackers and the location of the 6 Mile House. His account would become the crucial evidence needed to move against the Fishers. The authorities took Ross's accusations seriously. Highway robberies had plagued the area for too long, and now they finally had a witness who could identify the culprits. Warrants were issued for John and Lavinia Fisher, as well as several of their known associates. However, the Fishers had been warned that the law was coming. By the time officers arrived at the inn, the gang had vanished. The abandoned 6 Mile House was searched from top to bottom, but investigators found no evidence of the murders that would later be attributed to the Fishers. No secret rooms, no bodies. The hunt for the fugitives lasted months. The Fishers and their associates scattered, some fleeing to other states, others hiding in the swamps and forests around Charleston. Authorities offered rewards for information, and gradually, the members of the gang were tracked down and arrested. John and Lavinia Fisher were finally captured in the summer of 1819. They were brought back to Charleston and locked up in the Old City Jail to await trial. Built in 1802, the jail was a grim stone building that housed some of South Carolina's most dangerous criminals. It would be the Fishers' home for the last months of their lives. The investigation that followed revealed just how extensive the gang's operations had been. Authorities discovered that the Fishers had been involved in numerous robberies over several years, targeting dozens of victims and stealing thousands of dollars in cash and valuables. The scale of their criminal enterprise was far greater than anyone had first imagined. The trial of John and Lavinia Fisher began in the fall of 1819 and quickly became a sensation across South Carolina and beyond. The idea of a woman being tried for highway robbery was almost unheard of, and the public was captivated by the story of the criminal couple who had terrorized travelers for so long. The prosecution's case relied heavily on David Ross's testimony, as he described his experiences at the 6 Mile house and the attack that followed in vivid detail. Ross was a convincing witness, and his story was supported by other evidence gathered during the investigation. The defense faced an impossible task. John and Lavinia Fisher were clearly guilty of the crimes they were accused of, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Their lawyers tried to argue that the couple had been forced into crime by other gang members, but this was undermined by testimony showing that Lavinia, in particular, had been a willing and active participant. The trial also revealed the gang's careful planning and the violence they were willing to use. Witnesses described how the Fishers systematically gathered information about their victims, planned each robbery, and used force to get what they wanted. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence against Lavinia was her own behavior during the attack on David Ross. Multiple witnesses said she had not only taken part in the robbery but had been even more violent than some of the men. This destroyed any hope of portraying her as a victim of her husband's influence. The jury needed only a few hours to reach their decision. John and Lavinia Fisher were found guilty of highway robbery, which, under South Carolina law at the time, was a crime punishable by death. The judge sentenced both of them to be hanged on February 18, 1820. The verdict stirred controversy not because anyone doubted their guilt, but because many people felt that executing a woman, no matter her crimes, was inappropriate. Several appeals were made to have Lavinia's sentence reduced to life in prison, but none succeeded. Other members of the gang received a range of punishments. Some were also sentenced to death, while others faced long terms behind bars. Authorities wanted to send a clear message that highway robbery would not be tolerated, and they intended to make an example of the Fisher gang. In the months leading up to their execution, both John and Lavinia Fisher insisted they had never killed anyone, though they eventually admitted to the robberies. John seemed to find religion during his time in jail, spending his last weeks seeking forgiveness for his crimes. Lavinia, however, remained unrepentant and defiant. She refused to admit any wrongdoing and showed no remorse, which only strengthened the public's view of her as a dangerous and unyielding criminal. The execution of John and Lavinia Fisher became one of the most attended public events in Charleston's history. Nearly 2,000 people gathered to watch the hangings, turning the event into a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. People from all walks of life, wealthy plantation owners, laborers, townsfolk stood side by side, united by their fascination with the infamous couple who had terrorized their community. For many, the execution was not just justice served, but also a form of entertainment, the dramatic conclusion to a story that had gripped the city for months. John Fisher was the first to die. In his final moments, he reportedly expressed regret for his actions and asked for forgiveness from God and those he had harmed. He seemed to accept his fate with resignation, perhaps even relief. Lavinia's execution, on the other hand, was far more dramatic. Witnesses said she remained defiant until the very end. When asked for her last words, she is said to have delivered her famous line about carrying messages to hell. Whether she actually said this or if it was added later to enhance her legend is unclear. The details of her death also became the stuff of legend. Some claim she wore her wedding dress to the gallows, though this seems unlikely since her home had been destroyed and she'd been in jail for months. Others said she leaped from the platform herself rather than wait for the hangman, but this too appears to be a later embellishment. What is certain is that Lavinia Fisher's execution marked the end of one of early America's most notorious criminal enterprises. It also marked the beginning of a legend that would grow and change over the years, transforming a highway robber into the country's first female serial killer. In the years after their deaths, the story of John and Lavinia Fisher began to shift. The reality of highway robbery was gradually replaced by tales of serial murder and horror. The couple became infamous killers, their inn became a house of nightmares, and their crimes became the stuff of American folklore. This transformation didn't happen by accident. In the 19th century, there was a growing appetite for sensational crime stories, and publishers were eager to feed that demand. The Fisher story was perfect for this kind of literature, and with each retelling, it became more dramatic and less accurate. The legend of Lavinia Fisher also played into deep fears about women who broke social norms. In the early 1800s, women were expected to be gentle, nurturing, and obedient. The idea of a woman who was violent, manipulative, and criminal was both shocking and fascinating to the public. Over time, new details were added to make the story even more gripping, though less true. The poisoned tea, the trapdoors, the secret chambers, and the dozens of murdered victims were all inventions that made the legend more exciting but had no basis in fact. The transformation of Lavinia Fisher from highway robber to serial killer was also influenced by the setting of her crimes. Charleston, with its rich history and reputation for ghost stories, was the perfect backdrop. The tale of the 6 Mile House fit right in with the city's tradition of haunted places, and tour guides and storytellers eagerly adopted it for its commercial appeal. Modern historians who have studied the original records related to the Fisher case have found no evidence to support the serial killer narrative. Court documents, newspaper articles, and witness statements from the time all point to the same conclusion. John and Lavinia Fisher were highway robbers, not murderers. The lack of evidence for the murder claims is striking. If the Fishers had truly killed dozens of people, there would be records of missing persons, evidence of bodies or testimony from witnesses. Instead, there is nothing. The only crime that can be definitively proven is highway robbery, serious enough offense to warrant execution under the laws of that era. Still, the absence of evidence hasn't stopped the legend from growing. Today, Lavinia Fisher is still widely believed to be America's first female serial killer, and the story of the 6 Mile House is a staple of ghost tours and true crime books. The legend has become more powerful than the truth, and it seems unlikely that historical facts will ever fully replace it in the public's imagination. This brings us to some important questions about how we remember and interpret the past. The story of Lavinia Fisher is a perfect example of how legends can form around real people, turning them into something they never actually were. It also shows how our fascination with crime and violence can make us prefer sensational stories over the more ordinary, but true, realities. The case of John and Lavinia Fisher had a real impact on law enforcement and the justice system in early 19th century South Carolina. Their arrest and execution proved that the authorities were willing to go after criminals who operated outside the accepted boundaries of Charleston society. The Fisher case also highlighted the serious problem of highway robbery in the antebellum South. The couple's criminal operation was possible because the roads around Charleston were isolated and law enforcement in rural areas was weak. After their arrest, there were more patrols and better cooperation between local authorities, making it harder for similar gangs to operate. Legally, Lavinia Fisher's execution was significant because it set a precedent. Women could be held fully responsible for crimes, even those usually associated with men. This was a step forward in the evolution of women's legal status, though it came at a terrible price. Culturally, the story of Lavinia Fisher spread far beyond South Carolina. It became part of American folklore and helped shape what would later become the true crime genre. The public's fascination with her story revealed something about the American mindset and our relationship with crime and punishment. Even today, Lavinia Fisher's legacy continues to influence how we think about female criminals and the nature of evil. Whether her story is true or not, it has become part of the collective memory of American crime, retold in new ways for each new generation. The execution of John and Lavinia Fisher ended the reign of terror that had haunted the Charleston area for years. The rest of their gang was either executed or sent to prison, and the roads around the city became safer for travelers. The 6 Mile House itself was eventually destroyed, though no one knows exactly how. Some say angry citizens burned it down to erase all traces of the Fishers' crimes, while others believe it simply fell apart over time and was demolished. Today, other buildings stand where the inn once was, but the memory of what happened there still lingers. Local legends claim that the spirits of the Fishers and their victims haunt the area, making it a popular spot for ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts. The broader meaning of the Fisher case goes beyond its immediate impact on Charleston. Their story is a fascinating example of how historical truth can be changed by legend, and how our hunger for dramatic stories can sometimes overshadow our commitment to the facts. In the end, the real story of Lavinia Fisher might be even more interesting than the legend. She was a woman living in a time when choices were limited and survival often meant making hard decisions. Her choice to become a criminal was wrong, but it was also shaped by the world she lived in. The fact that she became a true partner in her husband's crimes, rather than just an accessory, shows a level of independence and agency that was rare for women of her time. Maybe that's why her story has lasted so long and continues to fascinate people more than 2 centuries after her death. Whether we remember her as a highway robber or as a serial killer, Lavinia Fisher remains an important figure in American criminal history. Her story reminds us that the past is often more complicated and unclear than we'd like to think, and that the line between truth and legend is not always easy to see. Thank you for watching. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more cases like this.